It was a chilly evening in Rome, the kind where the wind carried a bite that made even the most hardened locals quicken their steps. The streets near the Vatican were quieter than usual, the hustle and bustle of the day giving way to the stillness of night. Pope Francis, known for his humility and deep compassion, had just finished a long day of meetings and prayers. Instead of retiring to his quarters, he felt a familiar tug in his heart. A call to walk among the people, to be present where he was needed most. Dressed in his simple white cassock and zucchetto, Pope Francis stepped out into the cool night air. His security detail followed at a respectful distance, accustomed to his spontaneous outings. As he walked, he greeted passers-by with a warm smile and a gentle nod, his presence bringing a sense of calm to those who recognized him. But tonight, his steps led him to a quieter part of the city, where the glow of streetlights barely reached. It was there, on a worn wooden bench beneath a flickering street lamp, that Pope Francis saw him, a man sitting alone, his shoulders slumped and his face hidden in his hands. The man's clothes were tattered, his shoes worn thin, and his posture spoke of a deep, unrelenting sadness. Pope Francis felt a pang in his chest. He approached the man slowly, not wanting to startle him. "Good evening, my friend," Pope Francis said softly. "May I sit with you?" The man looked up, his eyes red and swollen from crying. His face was etched with lines of pain and exhaustion, and his hands trembled as he wiped away his tears. He nodded hesitantly, shifting slightly to make room on the bench. Pope Francis sat down beside him, his presence calm and reassuring. "What is your name?" he asked. The man hesitated before answering. "Marco," he said, his voice hoarse and barely above a whisper. "It's a pleasure to meet you, Marco," Pope Francis said with a warm smile. "Would you like to talk about what's troubling you?" Marco looked down at his hands, his breath shaky. I don't know where to begin," he said, his voice breaking. "Begin wherever you feel comfortable," Pope Francis replied gently. "Sometimes, sharing our burdens can lighten them." Marco took a deep breath and began to speak. He told Pope Francis about his life, how he had once been a successful engineer, how he had lost his job during the economic downturn, and how his wife had left him shortly after. He spoke of his struggles with depression, his battles with addiction, and the overwhelming sense of hopelessness that had consumed him. His voice trembled as he recounted the nights he had spent sleeping on park benches, the days he had gone without food, and the moments when he had felt utterly alone. "I've lost everything," Marco said, his voice breaking. "My family, my home, my dignity. I don't know why God has abandoned me." Pope Francis placed a hand on Marco's shoulder. "God has not abandoned you, my friend. He is here, with us, in this moment. Sometimes it is in our darkest hours that we feel His presence the most." Marco looked at the Pope, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and doubt. "How can you be so sure?" he asked. "Because I have seen it," Pope Francis replied. "I have seen God's love in the kindness of strangers, in the courage of those who suffer, and in the hope that never dies, no matter how difficult life becomes." Pope Francis reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden cross. He handed it to Marco, who took it with trembling hands. "This cross is a reminder that you are never alone," the Pope said. "God walks with you, even in your darkest moments." Marco clutched the cross tightly, tears streaming down his face. "Thank you," he whispered. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Pope Francis replied. "Just know that you are loved and that you matter." Over the next few weeks, Pope Francis made it a point to visit Marco whenever he could. He brought him food, warm clothes, and, most importantly, his presence. The two men would sit on the bench, talking about life, faith, and hope. Slowly but surely, Marco began to heal, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. With the Pope's encouragement, Marco started attending a local shelter, where he received help for his addiction and found a community of people who cared for him. He began to rebuild his life, one small step at a time. And though the road was long and difficult, he never forgot the kindness that had been shown to him. Pope Francis often shared Marco's story, without naming him, as a reminder of the importance of compassion and humility. He spoke about the need to see Christ in everyone, especially those who are suffering and marginalized. His encounter with Marco became a symbol of his papacy, a testament to the power of love and kindness. For Marco, the encounter was life-changing. He eventually found stable housing and reconnected with his family. He began volunteering at the shelter that had helped him, determined to pay forward the kindness he had received. And though he still carried the scars of his past, he also carried the small wooden cross that Pope Francis had given him, a reminder that he was never alone. Pope Francis's encounter with Marco taught him an important lesson about the power of presence. It wasn't about grand gestures or lofty words. It was about sitting with someone in their pain, sharing their burden, and reminding them that they are loved. It was a lesson he carried with him throughout his papacy, inspiring millions around the world to do the same. And for Marco, it was a moment that changed his life forever. A moment that showed him the true meaning of hope, love, and redemption.